Dr. Edmund Cross pushed open the heavy oak door of the Henley farmhouse, the October wind carrying the acrid smell of coal smoke and something else, something wrong that made his stomach clench before he even stepped inside. The kitchen lay in unnatural stillness, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock and Sarah Henley's shallow breathing as she stood frozen in the doorway behind him. Young Marcus sat at the rough-hewn table, his small frame perfectly motionless, pale hands folded in his lap like a miniature corpse prepared for viewing. His unnaturally blue eyes, the color of winter sky just before a storm, remained fixed on the wall behind Dr. Cross's head, unblinking, unmoving, as if the boy were studying something invisible hovering just above the doctor's shoulder. "He's been like this for 3 hours," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling hearth. "Just sitting there, staring. Won't eat, won't drink, won't even answer when I call his name." Dr. Cross set his leather medical bag on the table with deliberate care, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He had delivered Marcus 7 years ago in this very kitchen, had watched the boy take his first breath and heard his first cry. Now, studying the child's marble-still features, he felt as though he were looking at a stranger wearing Marcus Henley's face. "Hello, Marcus," Dr. Cross said, his voice measured and calm. "Your mother tells me you're not feeling well." The boy's lips remained closed, but something shifted behind those pale eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps something darker. Dr. Cross leaned closer, noting the complete absence of the small, unconscious movements that marked the living, no fidgeting, no adjustment of posture, no rise and fall of breath that he could detect. "When did this begin?" he asked Sarah, not taking his eyes off her son. "Yesterday morning," she replied, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He woke up normal, ate his breakfast, played with his wooden soldiers. Then around noon, he just stopped. Like someone had wound down a clockwork toy." Dr. Cross reached into his bag and withdrew his stethoscope, the cold metal alien in the warm kitchen air. As he moved to place it against Marcus's chest, the boy's head turned with mechanical precision, those unblinking eyes finally meeting the doctor's gaze. What Dr. Cross saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his days. The eyes that stared back at him held knowledge no 7-year-old should possess, ancient, weary knowledge that seemed to recognize him from somewhere far beyond this Pennsylvania farmhouse. Then Marcus spoke, and the voice that emerged from his small throat belonged to someone else entirely. "Dr. Cross, is it?" The words carried the thick accent of rural Ireland, spoken in the cadence of an elderly woman. "You've aged terribly since Seamus passed. Tell me, how long has my husband been in the ground now?" Sarah Henley's sharp intake of breath cut through the kitchen like a blade. Dr. Cross felt his hands begin to tremble as he recognized the voice, Bridget O'Malley, the Irish widow who had died of consumption 6 months ago. He had been there when she took her last breath, had watched Thomas Henley and 2 other men carry her pine coffin to the cemetery on the hill. "Marcus," Dr. Cross said carefully, his medical training warring with the primitive fear crawling up his spine. "Marcus, can you hear me?" The boy's head tilted slightly, and when he spoke again, the voice was different, deeper, masculine, with the rough edge of a man who had spent his life breathing coal dust. "Boy's not here right now, Doc," the voice said with a chuckle that sounded wrong coming from a child's mouth. "Name's Patrick Murphy. Died in the mine collapse last spring, if you remember. Left a wife and 3 little ones behind." Dr. Cross stumbled backward, his stethoscope clattering to the floor. Patrick Murphy had indeed died in the mine, crushed under a ton of fallen rock while his screams echoed through the tunnels. The man's body had been so mangled they'd barely managed to scrape enough of him together for a proper burial. "This isn't possible," Dr. Cross whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Marcus's face remained perfectly serene as the voice continued, now carrying Murphy's familiar tendency to scratch at his beard, except Marcus had no beard, and his small hand moved through empty air. "Lot of things ain't possible, Doc, but they happen all the same. The boy, he's special. Got himself a gift, you might say. Or maybe it's a curse. The child's mouth stretched into a smile that belonged on a much older face. Depends on how you look at it. Sarah finally found her voice, high and thin with terror. What's happened to my son? What's wrong with him? Marcus turned those pale, unblinking eyes toward his mother, and when he spoke, it was in Bridget O'Malley's voice again, gentle and sad. Nothing's wrong with him, dear. He's just become what he was always meant to be. A door, you see. A way for those of us who can't rest to speak again. Dr. Cross forced himself to move closer, his scientific mind grappling with what his eyes and ears were telling him. How many of you are there? The boy's expression shifted subtly, and now the voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Dr. Cross recognized it as belonging to Judge William Hartford, who had died of a stroke 2 years prior. More every day, Cross. The boy draws us like a flame draws moths. We find peace in speaking through him, in remembering what it felt like to draw a breath and feel sunlight on our faces. But why Marcus? Dr. Cross asked, his medical training demanding answers even as his faith in rational thought crumbled. Why this child? Marcus stood slowly, his movements precise and deliberate, as if each muscle responded to conscious thought rather than natural reflex. When he spoke, the voice belonged to someone Dr. Cross didn't recognize, an old woman with a slight German accent. The boy was born at the moment of the autumn equinox, when the veil between worlds grows thin. His mother labored for 3 days and 3 nights, and he came into this world just as the church bells struck midnight. Such children are rare, Dr. Cross. They see what others cannot see, hear what others cannot hear. Dr. Cross felt his rational worldview cracking like ice under pressure. What do you want from him? To speak. To be remembered. To feel, even briefly, the warmth of the living world again. Marcus's small hand reached out and touched Dr. Cross's wrist, and the doctor was startled by how cold the boy's flesh felt. But mostly, we want to warn you. Warn us about what? Marcus's face suddenly contorted in anguish, and when he spoke, it was in the voice of a child, but not his own voice. This belonged to a girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, speaking with the terror of someone who had died badly. The mine, the mine, the mine, the voice shrieked. Don't let them dig deeper. Don't let them break the stones. We tried to tell them, tried to make them listen, but they wouldn't stop digging. Sarah Henley pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a scream. Dr. Cross grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, feeling the boy's flesh cold and rigid beneath his grip. What stones? What are you talking about? But Marcus had fallen silent again, his eyes losing focus as if the presence speaking through him had suddenly withdrawn. For a moment, he looked like a normal 7-year-old boy again, confused, frightened, and very, very tired. Mama, he whispered in his own voice, small and uncertain. Why is Dr. Cross here? Did I have another spell? Sarah rushed to her son, gathering him into her arms and holding him tight against her chest. Over the boy's head, her eyes met Dr. Cross's, wide with a mother's terror. What's happening to him? She whispered. Dr. Cross had no answer. In all his years of medical practice, he had never encountered anything that resembled what he had just witnessed. As he gathered his instruments and prepared to leave, he noticed that Marcus had begun staring again, this time at the window, where the afternoon light was failing and shadows gathered like patient mourners. The boy hadn't blinked once during the entire encounter. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt like a stranger was staring back at you? 3 weeks had passed since Dr. Cross's first encounter with whatever was speaking through Marcus Henley, and he found himself returning to the farmhouse with the desperate hope that the boy's condition had improved. Instead, he discovered something far worse. The Henley kitchen had been transformed into something resembling a medical laboratory. Dr. Cross's leather journals lay open across every available surface, their pages covered with meticulous notes documenting Marcus's supernatural abilities. Charts tracking the boy's vital signs, or lack thereof, hung from the walls, alongside sketches of his unchanging facial expressions and transcripts of conversations with the dead. Marcus sat in the same chair, in precisely the same position as 3 weeks ago. His pale blue eyes had not closed once in that time, according to his mother's increasingly frantic observations. Sarah looked as though she had aged a decade, her face gaunt with sleepless worry, her hands shaking as she poured Dr. Cross a cup of coffee. "He speaks to them every day now," she whispered, glancing nervously at her son. "Sometimes for hours. Last night, he was talking to at least 5 different people at once, having conversations with empty air." Dr. Cross set down his medical bag and approached Marcus cautiously. The boy's appearance had begun to change in subtle but disturbing ways. His skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, as if the life was slowly draining from his flesh. More unsettling still, his facial features seemed to shift depending on which voice was speaking through him. The set of his jaw would alter, the shape of his mouth would adjust, even the color of his eyes appeared to fluctuate between shades of blue and gray. "Good afternoon, Marcus," Dr. Cross said carefully. The boy's head turned with that same mechanical precision, and when he spoke, it was in the voice of Bridget O'Malley again. "Dr. Cross, so good of you to visit. I was just telling young Patrick here about the terrible state of my garden. The roses haven't been tended since I passed, and they're growing wild now, climbing over the cemetery gates." Dr. Cross pulled out his notebook and began writing, his scientific training demanding documentation even as his soul recoiled from what he was witnessing. "Mrs. O'Malley," he said, feeling foolish for addressing a dead woman through a 7-year-old boy. "Can you tell me how many of you are speaking through Marcus?" The boy's expression shifted, and now the voice belonged to Patrick Murphy, the miner who had died in the cave-in. "Hard to say, document. We come and go as we please. Some of us are stronger than others, can hold on longer. But there's dozens of us now, maybe more. Word spreads fast among the dead." Dr. Cross made another note, his hand trembling slightly. "What determines who can speak through him?" Marcus's face took on the stern expression Dr. Cross remembered from Judge William Hartford, and the boy's posture straightened with judicial authority. "Proximity seems to matter. Those of us buried in Centralia's cemetery find it easier to reach the boy. But it's not just about distance, it's about connection, about unfinished business that ties us to this place." "What kind of unfinished business?" The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees, and when Marcus spoke again, it was in a voice Dr. Cross had never heard before, a middle-aged woman with a slight Scottish accent. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and I died in childbirth 40 years ago. My baby lived only 3 days, but I never got to hold her, never got to say goodbye. Through this boy, I can feel what it's like to touch someone again, to speak words of love that were stolen from me." Dr. Cross looked up from his notes to see tears streaming down Marcus's face, though the boy's expression remained eerily calm. "And you, Patrick Murphy? What keeps you here?" The boy's voice dropped to Murphy's familiar rough baritone. "My youngest daughter, she's only 4. I want to tell her that Daddy's accident wasn't her fault, that she shouldn't blame herself for not hugging me goodbye that morning. Children carry guilt that ain't theirs to bear." Sarah Henley, who had been listening from the corner, finally spoke up. "But what about Marcus? What about my son? Is he still in there?" The boy turned to look at his mother, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to focus with genuine recognition. When he spoke, it was in his own voice, small and confused. "Mama, I'm here. I can hear them all talking, but they're not scary. They're just sad, and they miss being alive. Sometimes I forget which voice is mine." Dr. Cross felt his heart clench at the child's words. "Marcus, can you tell the voices to leave? Can you ask them to go away? The boy shook his head slowly. They can't go away, Dr. Cross. They're trapped, like birds in a cage. The mining woke them up, disturbed their sleep, and now they can't find their way back to the quiet place. Before Dr. Cross could respond, Marcus's expression changed again, this time taking on the features of someone much older. The voice that emerged was that of an elderly man with a cultured accent. My name is Professor Aldrich Blackwood, and I died in this very house 60 years ago. I was researching the Celtic burial grounds that once stood where Centralia now sits. The miners have broken sacred seals, Dr. Cross. They've disturbed something that was meant to remain undisturbed. Dr. Cross leaned forward, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. What kind of seals? The ancient Celts knew how to bind restless spirits, how to keep the dead from interfering with the living. They carved protective symbols into standing stones and placed them at specific points around their burial grounds. When the mining company dynamited those stones to clear the land, they destroyed barriers that had held for 1,000 years. The implications of what Dr. Cross was hearing sent a chill through his bones. Are you saying that all of Centralia's dead are trapped here? Marcus's face contorted with sudden anguish, and a chorus of voices seemed to speak through him simultaneously, old and young, male and female, all overlapping in a cacophony of desperate whispers. Not trapped, they said in unison. Awakened. And growing stronger every day. The boy is our anchor to the living world, our voice in a realm we can no longer touch. But Dr. Cross, you must understand, we are not the only ones who were disturbed by the mining. Dr. Cross felt his blood turn to ice. What do you mean? Marcus stood abruptly, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if his limbs were being controlled by multiple conflicting wills. When he spoke, it was in a voice none of them had heard before, ancient, powerful, and filled with malevolent intent. Deep beneath the coal veins, in chambers older than human memory, things sleep that should never wake. The miners' dynamite has cracked their prison walls, and they stir now in the darkness, testing their bonds. Sarah Henley grabbed her son's shoulders, her maternal instincts overriding her terror. Stop it. Stop using my boy like this. He's just a child. But Marcus pulled away from her with inhuman strength, his pale eyes now reflecting the lamplight like mirrors. The child chose his role, woman. He opened himself to us willingly, and now he serves a purpose greater than one small life. Through him, we can warn you of what approaches. Through him, we can prepare you for what's coming. Dr. Cross stepped between mother and son, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. What's coming? What are you preparing us for? Marcus's face went suddenly blank, his eyes losing all expression as if every spirit had simultaneously withdrawn from his small body. He swayed on his feet, and Dr. Cross caught him before he could fall. For a moment, Marcus was simply a 7-year-old boy again, exhausted, confused, and very much alone. He looked up at Dr. Cross with his own eyes, and whispered in his own voice. They're afraid, Dr. Cross. All the dead people are afraid of something much worse than being dead. And they think it's almost time for it to wake up. Then the boy's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed unconscious in Dr. Cross's arms. For the first time in 3 weeks, Marcus Henley's eyelids finally closed. But even in sleep, his lips continued to move silently, as if carrying on conversations with invisible companions that only he could hear. Dr. Cross left the Henley farmhouse with more questions than answers, his medical bag heavy with journals documenting phenomena that no medical school had prepared him to understand. The October evening was crisp and clear, but he felt as though he were walking through a fog of dread that clung to his clothes and followed him down the dusty road toward town. St. Bartholomew's Church stood on a small hill overlooking Centralia, its stone spire piercing the darkening sky like an accusation. Father Mackenzie was lighting candles in the sanctuary when Dr. Cross pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The familiar smell of incense and old wood providing little comfort against the supernatural horrors he had witnessed. "Edmund," the priest said, turning from the altar with a concerned expression. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." The words hung in the air between them, and Dr. Cross felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. "I'm afraid it's much worse than that, Father. I've seen dozens of them, all speaking through a 7-year-old boy who hasn't blinked in nearly a month." Father Mackenzie was a practical man, born in County Cork and raised on stories that most educated people dismissed as peasant superstition. But something in Dr. Cross's voice made him set down his candle and gesture toward the front pew. "Tell me everything," the priest said simply. Dr. Cross recounted his encounters with Marcus Henley, sparing no detail of the voices, the impossible knowledge, the boy's physical transformation. As he spoke, Father Mackenzie's expression grew increasingly grave, his weathered hands working the rosary beads in his pocket with nervous energy. "You said the boy mentioned Celtic burial grounds," Father Mackenzie said when Dr. Cross had finished. "How much do you know about the land Centralia was built on?" "I know the mining company cleared it 12 years ago. Dynamited whatever was in their way and dug their shafts." Father Mackenzie stood and walked to a cabinet behind the altar, returning with a leather-bound book that looked far older than anything else in the church. The pages crackled as he opened it, revealing hand-drawn maps and text written in Gaelic script. "This belonged to my grandfather, God rest his soul. He was a scholar of the old ways before he came to America. According to his research, this entire area was once sacred to the ancient Celts, a place where they performed rituals to keep the dead at rest and darker things bound in the earth." Dr. Cross studied the faded drawings, noting symbols carved into standing stones and arrangements of burial mounds that formed intricate patterns across the landscape. "The mining company destroyed all of this. Every stone, every burial mound, every protective ward that had stood for 1,000 years. Father Mackenzie traced one of the symbols with his finger. "My grandfather wrote about cases like young Marcus's, children born at spiritually significant times who become conduits for disturbed spirits. But Edmund, if what you're telling me is true, the boy's condition is only the beginning." Before Dr. Cross could ask what the priest meant, the church doors burst open and Thomas Henley stumbled inside, his clothes torn and his face wild with panic. "Father Mackenzie. Dr. Cross." Thomas gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You have to come quick. Something's happened to Marcus, something terrible." They found Sarah Henley standing in the middle of Centralia's cemetery, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared at her son with a mixture of terror and heartbreak. Marcus stood among the weathered headstones, his pale form illuminated by moonlight, engaged in what appeared to be animated conversations with empty graves. "He's been like this for an hour," Sarah whispered as the 3 men approached. "Talking to different graves, laughing, crying, arguing with people who aren't there. But Dr. Cross, I can hear other voices now, faint, but I can hear them responding to him." Dr. Cross strained his ears and felt his skin crawl as he caught the sound of whispered responses carried on the night wind, dozens of voices, all speaking at once in a susurrus of desperate communication. Marcus moved from headstone to headstone with purpose, his unblinking eyes bright with an inner light that seemed to grow stronger in the darkness. At Margaret Thompson's grave, he knelt and spoke in her Scottish accent. "I know, dear, I know you're tired of waiting. But the doctor's here now, and the priest too. Maybe they can help us find our way to the quiet place." He stood and walked to Patrick Murphy's fresh grave, his voice dropping to the miner's familiar rasp. "Doc, you need to listen to us now. The mine's not safe, hasn't been safe since they broke the old stones. There's something down there in the deepest shafts, something that was locked away for good reason." Dr. Cross approached carefully, his medical training warring with the primitive fear that screamed at him to run. "Patrick, what's down there? What are you afraid of?" Marcus turned from the grave, and his face contorted with an expression of such ancient terror that Dr. Cross stumbled backward. "Not Patrick," the boy said in a voice none of them recognized, something old and powerful and filled with barely contained rage. "I am the one they tried to bind with their stones and their spells. I am the hunger that sleeps beneath the coal, the darkness that devours light." The boy's voice grows stronger, and soon I will be strong enough to break my remaining chains. Father Mackenzie stepped forward, pulling his rosary from his pocket with hands that shook only slightly. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to." Marcus's head snapped toward the priest with inhuman speed, and when he spoke, his child's voice carried the weight of centuries. "Your Christ has no power here, priest. This land was old when his followers first set foot on these shores. The boy belongs to older laws now, older purposes. Through him, I will taste freedom again." The temperature in the cemetery plummeted, and frost began forming on the headstones despite the mild October evening. Marcus raised his arms, and every grave around them seemed to exhale simultaneously, a collective sigh of the restless dead that rustled through the grass like wind through wheat. "But first," the entity speaking through Marcus continued, "I will need sustenance. The mining has awakened me, but I remain weak from my long imprisonment. Soon, very soon, I will require sacrifices." Sarah Henley let out a sob and rushed toward her son, but Thomas caught her arm and held her back. "That's not Marcus," he said, his voice breaking. "Look at his eyes, Sarah. That's not our boy." Dr. Cross forced himself to move closer, his scientific mind still seeking rational explanations even as his faith in rationality crumbled. "What do you want from the boy? Why Marcus?" The entity smiled with Marcus's mouth, but the expression was ancient and cruel. "The child was born at the perfect moment, when my prison walls were already weakened by the miners' explosions. His innocent soul provides the perfect vessel, pure enough to channel the dead, yet malleable enough to serve darker purposes. Through him, I can influence the living world. Through him, I can feed." Father Mackenzie began reciting prayers in Latin, his voice growing stronger with each word. The entity inhabiting Marcus laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Pray all you wish, priest. Your God abandoned this place when the first Celtic druids claimed it for their own rituals. I am older than your Savior, more primal than your heaven. I am the darkness that waits beneath every grave, the hunger that gnaws at the bones of the earth itself." Suddenly, Marcus collapsed to his knees, his small body convulsing as if multiple forces were fighting for control. When he looked up, his eyes were his own again, terrified, confused, and very much a 7-year-old boy. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to howl through the cemetery. "It's getting stronger, and I can't keep it out anymore. It wants to use me to hurt people, to make them like the dead ones who can't rest." Dr. Cross knelt beside the boy, gathering him into his arms despite his fear. Marcus's skin was ice-cold, and his small body felt unnaturally light, as if the essence of him were slowly being drained away. "We'll help you, Marcus. We'll find a way to stop this." But even as he spoke the words, Dr. Cross could see the doubt in Father Mackenzie's eyes, the terror in the parents' faces. Whatever had been awakened beneath Centralia was growing stronger with each passing day, and a 7-year-old boy was the only thing standing between an ancient evil and the living world. As they carried Marcus home through the moonlit streets, none of them noticed the way shadows seemed to follow in their wake, or how the very air around the boy shimmered with malevolent energy that grew thicker with each step. The entity was patient. It had waited centuries for an opportunity like this, and it could wait a little longer. Soon, very soon, the boy's resistance would crumble, and then the real feast could begin. Dr. Cross had not slept in 4 days. His study had become a shrine to madness, every surface covered with medical journals, anatomical diagrams, and increasingly frantic notes documenting Marcus Henley's impossible condition. Empty coffee cups and half-eaten meals littered his desk, forgotten in his obsessive pursuit of answers that medical science could not provide. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in anatomy and chemistry and the observable laws of nature, screamed that what he was witnessing defied every principle of human biology. But the evidence was undeniable, recorded in his own careful handwriting across hundreds of pages. Marcus had not blinked in 26 days, had not eaten solid food in 18 days, and had not slept in over a week. His heart rate had dropped to barely 20 beats per minute, his body temperature hovered at a hypothermic 79 degrees, and yet he continued to speak, to move, to channel the voices of the dead with increasing clarity and accuracy. Dr. Cross pushed aside a stack of medical texts and opened his newest journal to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, November 15, 1879, subject continues to demonstrate physiological impossibilities. A knock at his door interrupted his work. Thomas Henley stood on his front porch, hat in hand, his weathered face etched with exhaustion and something approaching panic. "Doc, I need you to come quick. Marcus, he's done something. Something that's got the whole town talking." They rode in silence through Centralia's dusty streets, past clusters of miners and townspeople who watched them with expressions of fearful curiosity. As they approached the town square, Dr. Cross saw what had drawn the crowd, a circle of people surrounding something near the center fountain, their voices hushed but agitated. Marcus stood in the middle of the circle, perfectly still as always, his pale blue eyes fixed on Robert Walsh, the mine foreman, a man built like a tree trunk with hands the size of dinner plates. Walsh was backing away from the boy, his face drained of color despite his usual ruddy complexion. "Tell them what I said, Mr. Walsh," Marcus spoke in his own voice, though something in his tone suggested the words came from elsewhere. "Tell them about the cave-in that's coming tomorrow." Walsh's hands trembled as he addressed the crowd. "The boy, he came up to me an hour ago and started talking about Shaft 7. Said there's going to be a collapse tomorrow around 2 in the afternoon. Described it in detail, which support beams would fail first, how many men would be trapped, even how long it would take for some of them to die." Dr. Cross felt his stomach clench. The boy's supernatural abilities had been confined to speaking with the already dead, but if Marcus was now predicting future deaths. "It's just the ramblings of a sick child," Dr. Cross said loudly, though his voice lacked conviction. "The boy has been suffering from a nervous condition. His words mean nothing." Marcus turned those unblinking eyes toward the doctor, and when he spoke, it was in Patrick Murphy's familiar Irish brogue. "Doc, you know better than that. How many times have I told you things about my death that nobody but me could know? How many conversations have we had about the exact moment that support beam cracked and the ceiling came down?" The crowd murmured uneasily. Several miners began backing away from Marcus, crossing themselves and whispering prayers. "Besides," Marcus continued, his voice shifting to that of an elderly woman Dr. Cross didn't recognize, "young Robert here has been cutting corners on safety inspections. Skipping the checks that might have prevented what's coming. Isn't that right, Mr. Walsh?" Walsh's face went from pale to gray. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," Marcus said, his child's voice carrying the authority of someone much older. "You've been falsifying inspection reports for 3 months now, ever since the company threatened to dock your pay for delays. Beam 7C has a hairline crack that you marked as structurally sound just last week." The foreman stumbled backward as if struck. "How could you possibly know that?" Marcus smiled with the serene expression of a child discussing the weather. "The dead see everything, Mr. Walsh. We watch, we listen, we remember. And tomorrow, when Shaft 7 collapses exactly as I've described, we'll welcome 3 new voices to our number." Dr. Cross pushed through the crowd and grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, feeling the boy's unnaturally cold flesh beneath his clothes. "That's enough, Marcus. You're frightening people." "I'm warning people," the boy replied, his voice cycling through different speakers with each word. The mine is dangerous. The old protections are broken. Things are stirring in the deep places that should stay buried. Before Dr. Cross could respond, Marcus suddenly went rigid, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. When he spoke again, it was in the terrible voice of the ancient entity they had encountered in the cemetery. But warnings are just the beginning, Doctor. Soon I will have gathered enough strength to act directly. The boy's resistance weakens with each passing day, and when it finally breaks. Marcus's head snapped upright, his pale eyes now reflecting the afternoon sunlight like mirrors. When it breaks, this town will learn what true hunger looks like. The crowd scattered, miners and townspeople fleeing in all directions as an unnatural chill descended over the square. Only Dr. Cross and Thomas Henley remained, staring at the boy who stood motionless in the sudden emptiness. "We have to get him away from here," Thomas whispered. "People are starting to talk about taking action." That evening, Dr. Cross sat in his study, writing furiously by lamplight. His hands shook as he recorded the day's events, the implications of Marcus's predictions weighing on his mind like a physical burden. "If the boy can truly foresee future deaths," he wrote, "then his condition has evolved beyond simple spiritual possession. He has become something unprecedented, a living bridge between past, present, and future, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Henley stood in his doorway, her face streaked with tears. "Dr. Cross," she whispered, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have mentioned weeks ago." She sat in the chair across from his desk, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders like armor against the truth she was about to reveal. "Marcus wasn't born naturally," she said, her voice barely audible. "The labor, it went on for days. I was dying, and the baby wasn't coming. Father Mackenzie, he performed some kind of ritual. Said words in a language I didn't recognize, burned herbs that smelled like grave dirt. When Marcus finally came, it was at the exact moment of midnight on All Hallows' Eve." Dr. Cross set down his pen, his mind racing with the implications. "Father Mackenzie never mentioned this. I made him promise not to tell anyone. But Dr. Cross, what if the ritual, what if it marked Marcus somehow? What if it made him into what he's become?" Before Dr. Cross could answer, a commotion outside drew their attention to the window. In the street below, Robert Walsh was running toward the church, shouting at the top of his lungs. It happened. Just like the boy said. Shaft 7 collapsed at exactly 2 o'clock. 3 men trapped, God help us all. Dr. Cross felt the last vestiges of his rational worldview crumble into dust. Marcus Henley wasn't just channeling the dead, he was prophesying future deaths with terrifying accuracy. And if the ancient entity speaking through him was growing stronger. "Sarah," Dr. Cross said quietly, "I think we're going to need more help than medical science can provide." Outside, the church bells began tolling for the dead, their bronze voices carrying across Centralia like a warning that arrived too late. Would you protect a child who speaks for the dead, even if it meant your own destruction? The mine collapse changed everything. Within hours of the accident, word had spread through Centralia like wildfire that young Marcus Henley had predicted the disaster with uncanny precision. What had once been whispered speculation became open fear, and fear in a small mining town could turn deadly faster than a cave-in. Dr. Cross found himself standing in the Henley kitchen once again, but this time he wasn't alone. A dozen townspeople crowded into the small room, their faces hard with the kind of anger that comes from fear pushed too far. At their head stood Mayor William Crawford, his usually diplomatic demeanor replaced by something approaching desperation. "Dr. Cross," Crawford said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "3 good men are dead because of what that boy predicted. Jacob Morrison left behind a wife and 4 children. Samuel Price was 2 weeks from retirement. And young Timothy Walsh, Robert's own nephew, was crushed trying to shore up the supports that everyone now knows were faulty. Marcus sat at his usual place at the kitchen table, his pale eyes tracking the conversation with unnatural focus. He had not moved from that chair in 6 hours, had not eaten the bowl of soup Sarah had placed before him, had not acknowledged the angry voices filling his home. But Dr. Cross could see the subtle changes in the boy's face, the way his features seemed to shift and flow as different voices prepared to speak through him. The boy didn't cause the collapse, Dr. Cross said carefully, though he wasn't entirely certain of his own words. He warned about it. If Mr. Walsh had listened. If Mr. Walsh had listened, he'd be branded a madman for taking orders from a 7-year-old possessed by demons, Crawford interrupted. But that's not the point, Doctor. The point is that boy is dangerous. Whatever's speaking through him isn't natural, and it's getting stronger. As if summoned by the accusation, Marcus's head turned with mechanical precision toward the crowd. When he spoke, it was in the voice of Jacob Morrison, one of the men who had died in yesterday's collapse. Mayor Crawford, the boy said in Morrison's familiar baritone, "You're right to be afraid. But you're afraid of the wrong thing. My death, Samuel's death, Timothy's death, they're just the beginning. What lives beneath the mine is waking up, and when it finally breaks free." Marcus's voice trailed off, his small body convulsing as if multiple forces were fighting for control. When he spoke again, it was in Samuel Price's weathered voice, carrying the wisdom of a man who had spent 40 years in the mines. "The deepest shafts have been making sounds, Crawford. Sounds like breathing, like something enormous stirring in its sleep. The boys who work down there, they're scared to go below the 3rd level now. Even the rats have abandoned the lower tunnels." Dr. Cross felt his blood turn cold. What kind of sounds? Marcus turned those unblinking eyes toward him, and his face took on the terrified expression of young Timothy Walsh. "Like a heartbeat, Dr. Cross. But big, so big it makes the whole mine shake with each pulse. And sometimes you can hear it whispering in a language that ain't human. The words hurt your ears just to listen to them." Sarah Henley, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally found her voice. "My son is not responsible for those men's deaths," she said, her maternal fury overriding her fear. "He tried to warn people. If you had listened instead of calling him possessed. Because he is possessed." The shout came from Robert Walsh, who pushed through the crowd with eyes red from grief and guilt. "My nephew is dead because I didn't take seriously the ravings of a demon child. Timothy was 18 years old, had his whole life ahead of him, and now he's buried under a ton of rock because I was too proud to evacuate a shaft based on supernatural nonsense." Marcus smiled then, an expression of such serene cruelty that it silenced the entire room. When he spoke, it was in the voice of the ancient entity that had claimed him. "Your pride didn't kill the boy, Walsh. Your greed did. Your willingness to cut corners, to falsify reports, to sacrifice safety for profit. I merely accelerated the inevitable." The temperature in the kitchen dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost began forming on the windows despite the November warmth outside, and every breath became visible as the assembled townspeople backed away from Marcus in terror. "But their deaths serve a greater purpose," the entity continued through the boy's mouth. "Each life lost strengthens my connection to this world. Each soul claimed adds to my power. Soon, very soon, I will have gathered enough energy to break the remaining bonds that hold me." Father Mackenzie pushed through the crowd, his rosary clutched in one hand and an old leather book in the other. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to release this child." The entity inhabiting Marcus laughed, a sound like grinding stone that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Still playing with your toys, priest? Your God has no power here. This land was consecrated to older, darker purposes long before your Christ walked the earth." Father Mackenzie opened his book and began reading in Gaelic, his voice growing stronger with each ancient word. The entity's laughter faltered, and Marcus's face contorted with what might have been pain. "Clever priest," the entity hissed. "You think the old binding spells will work against me? The miners destroyed those protections when they shattered the standing stones. I am free now, free to feed, free to grow, free to reclaim what was stolen from me centuries ago." Dr. Cross watched in horror as Marcus began to change before their eyes. The boy's skin took on a grayish pallor, his fingernails grew longer and darker, and his pale blue eyes started to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected flame. "But I am not ungrateful," the entity said, its voice now carrying harmonics that hurt to hear. "The boy has served me well, has provided the perfect vessel for my return. In recognition of his service, I will make his death quick when the time comes. The rest of you." Marcus stood slowly, his movements no longer entirely human. As he rose, every piece of glass in the kitchen began to vibrate, creating a discordant symphony that set teeth on edge. "The rest of you will feed my hunger for decades to come." Thomas Henley, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward and placed himself between his son and the crowd. "That's enough," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "Whatever's happening to Marcus, he's still my boy. And I won't let you hurt him." The entity looked at Thomas through Marcus's eyes, and for a moment, something almost resembling curiosity flickered in that inhuman gaze. "Fascinating," it said. "Even knowing what your son has become, what he will help me accomplish, you still choose to protect him. Such loyalty is admirable. Perhaps I will spare you when the feeding begins." "There won't be any feeding," Dr. Cross said, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "We'll find a way to stop you. We'll find a way to save Marcus." "Will you?" the entity asked, and Marcus's mouth stretched into a smile that was all sharp teeth and malevolent joy. "Then you had better hurry, Doctor. The mind continues to weaken the barriers between worlds with every day that passes. The deeper they dig, the closer they come to my prison. And when they finally break through to the deepest chamber." Marcus's eyes rolled back in his head, and when he spoke again, it was in a voice none of them recognized, something vast and ancient and filled with apocalyptic hunger. "When they break through, I will be free to walk the earth again. Free to feast upon the living, to turn their bones to dust and their souls to shadows. This town will be the first to fall, but it will not be the last. From Centralia, my influence will spread like plague, consuming everything in its path until the world remembers why it once feared the dark." The boy collapsed then, his small body hitting the floor with a sound like breaking pottery. For a moment, Marcus was simply a 7-year-old child again, unconscious, fragile, and impossibly innocent despite the terrible words that had just poured from his mouth. Dr. Cross knelt beside him, checking for a pulse and finding it barely perceptible. The boy's skin was cold as winter earth, his breathing so shallow it was almost undetectable. "We need to get him away from here," Dr. Cross said, looking up at the crowd of frightened faces. "Away from the mine, away from whatever's influencing him." Mayor Crawford shook his head. "It's too late for that, Doctor. Whatever that thing is, it's not going to let the boy go. And we can't risk it spreading to other children, other towns." "What are you suggesting?" Crawford's face was grim as he met Dr. Cross's eyes. "I'm suggesting that sometimes, to save many lives, you have to sacrifice one." Sarah Henley let out a sob and gathered her unconscious son into her arms, holding him against her chest like a shield against the world's cruelty. "You'll have to go through me first," she whispered, her voice carrying the fierce protection of a mother facing the impossible choice between her child's life and everyone else's safety. As the townspeople filed out of the kitchen, their faces heavy with the weight of decisions no one should have to make, Dr. Cross remained behind with the Henley family. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the Pennsylvania hills like the footsteps of something vast and hungry approaching from the darkness. Time was running out, and Dr. Cross had no idea how to save a boy who might already be lost to forces beyond human understanding. The decision came at dawn, when Thomas Henley found his son standing in the barn, speaking to empty stalls in voices that belonged to livestock long since slaughtered. Marcus had not returned to the house after losing consciousness the previous evening. Instead, he had somehow transported himself to the barn, where he now conducted conversations with the spirits of dead animals with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for human ghosts. "The cows are restless," Marcus said in his own voice as his father approached, though his eyes remained fixed on an empty stall. "They remember being afraid before they died. Something in the ground beneath their hooves made them nervous, made them want to run." Thomas knelt beside his son, his weathered hands shaking as he reached out to touch the boy's cold cheek. "Marcus," he said gently, "can you hear me? Can you hear your father?" The boy turned those pale, unblinking eyes toward him, and for a moment, Thomas saw a flicker of the child he had raised, confused, frightened, and desperately seeking comfort. "Papa," Marcus whispered, "I'm scared. The voices are getting louder, and I can't make them stop. They're all so afraid of what's coming, and they want me to help them run away. But I don't know how." Thomas gathered his son into his arms, feeling the unnatural coldness of the boy's flesh and the way his small body seemed almost weightless, as if whatever had once made Marcus human was slowly being drained away. "We're going to help you," Thomas said, though he had no idea how. "Your mother and we're going to find a way to make this stop." When they returned to the farmhouse, they found Dr. Cross waiting in the kitchen with a leather satchel and a grim expression that spoke of desperate measures. "I've been thinking about what that entity said," Dr. Cross began without preamble. "About the mind weakening the barriers, about something imprisoned in the deepest chambers. If we can understand what was originally bound there, perhaps we can find a way to strengthen those bindings again." Sarah looked up from the cold breakfast she had been mechanically preparing. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we go to the source. To the deepest parts of the mind, where this all began. Father Mackenzie has been researching the old Celtic protections. He believes there might be surviving artifacts in the original chambers, things the mining company missed when they cleared the land." Thomas shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. 3 men just died down there, and you want to take Marcus back to the very place that's poisoning him?" "The boy is dying anyway," Dr. Cross said quietly. "Look at him, Thomas. Really look at him. When was the last time you saw him eat? Sleep? Behave like a normal child? Whatever that entity is, it's consuming him from the inside out. If we don't act soon, there won't be anything left of Marcus to save." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Marcus looked up from his untouched breakfast and spoke in the voice of Professor Aldrich Blackwood, the scholar who had died in their house 60 years earlier. "The doctor is correct. The boy's life force is being systematically drained to fuel my prison mate's return to the physical world. Each day he grows weaker while it grows stronger. Soon, the balance will tip irrevocably." Dr. Cross leaned forward, addressing the spirit directly. "Professor Blackwood, you studied the Celtic bindings. What would we need to restore them?" Marcus's face took on the stern expression of academic authority. "The original binding required 3 elements: blood from the land's protectors, words of power spoken in the old tongue, and most importantly, a willing sacrifice to serve as the eternal guardian between worlds." Sarah Henley's cup shattered against the kitchen floor. "You're talking about sacrificing my son." "Not sacrificing," the professor's voice corrected gently. "Transforming." The Celtic druids understood that some threats require permanent watchers, souls willing to stand guard between the world of the living and the realm of the hungry dark. Such guardians are honored, revered, and... Marcus's voice faltered, and when he spoke again, it was in his own frightened whisper. And they can never go home again. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock and Sarah's muffled sobs. Dr. Cross felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a burial shroud. "There has to be another way," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Father Mackenzie chose that moment to arrive, his arms laden with ancient books and artifacts that looked as old as the hills themselves. His face was drawn with exhaustion and something approaching despair. "I've spent the night in prayer and research," he announced, setting his burden on the kitchen table. "The Celtic bindings can be restored, but Dr. Cross is right about the cost. The ritual requires a living soul to serve as the guardian, someone pure enough to resist corruption and strong enough to hold the barrier for eternity." "How long is eternity for a guardian?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow. Father Mackenzie opened one of the ancient texts, pointing to symbols that seemed to shift and writhe on the yellowed pages. "According to these accounts, the original guardian has been standing watch for over 1,000 years. Time moves differently for such beings, they exist outside the normal flow of life and death, aging slowly if at all, sustained by the spiritual energy of their sacred duty." Marcus suddenly stood, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if his limbs were being manipulated by invisible strings. When he spoke, it was in the terrible voice of the ancient entity. "Touching reunion, truly. But I'm afraid your plans are too late. The miners have just broken through to the deepest chamber. Even now, my physical prison crumbles, and I taste freedom for the first time in a millennium." As if to punctuate the entity's words, the church bells began tolling in the distance, the emergency signal that meant disaster at the mine. "No," Thomas breathed, but Marcus was already moving toward the door with inhuman purpose. "Yes," the entity hissed through the boy's mouth. "The final barrier falls, and I rise to reclaim what is mine. This world, this reality, these fragile human lives, all will serve my hunger in the end." Dr. Cross grabbed his medical bag and Father Mackenzie's satchel of artifacts. "If we're going to do this, we have to do it now. Before that thing breaks free completely." The family ran toward town as the emergency bells continued their bronze warning across the Pennsylvania hills. Behind them, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. At the mine entrance, chaos reigned. Workers streamed out of the shafts, their faces black with coal dust and white with terror. Foreman Robert Walsh met them at the gate, his eyes wild with the kind of fear that breaks strong men. "Dr. Cross, thank God," Walsh gasped. "The men broke through to a chamber we didn't know existed. There's something down there, something that ain't natural. The air itself seems alive, and there's a sound like breathing," Marcus finished in his own voice, though his eyes reflected depths no child should possess. "It's waking up, Mr. Walsh. And it's very, very hungry." Dr. Cross looked at the mine entrance, a mouth of darkness that seemed to exhale malevolence with each gust of wind that emerged from its depths. Somewhere in those tunnels lay the source of Marcus's condition, the ancient prison that was now cracking open like an egg ready to hatch something monstrous. "Thomas," Dr. Cross said quietly, "if we go down there, we might not come back up. Any of us." Thomas Henley looked at his son, who stood perfectly still in the gathering darkness, his pale eyes reflecting the mine's electric lights like mirrors. The boy who had laughed and played and dreamed of becoming a doctor was disappearing more completely with each passing hour, replaced by something that served purposes too ancient and terrible for human understanding. "He's my son," Thomas said simply. "And I won't let him face this alone." As they descended into the mine, following tunnels that grew darker and more oppressive with each step, none of them noticed the way shadows seemed to writhe independently of their lantern light, or how the very walls appeared to pulse with a rhythm like an enormous heartbeat. Deep below, in chambers older than human memory, something stirred in the darkness and smiled with anticipation. The boy was coming home at last, and with him came the final key to freedom that had been denied for 1,000 years. The hunt was almost over, and the feeding could finally begin. The mine's deepest level was a cathedral of shadows and ancient stone, carved from bedrock that predated human civilization by millennia. Electric lights had been strung along the newer tunnels, but their glow faltered and died as Dr. Cross, the Henley family, and Father Mackenzie descended beyond the reach of modern convenience into passages lit only by the flickering flames of their lanterns. Marcus walked ahead of the group with mechanical precision, his small form moving through the darkness as if guided by invisible hands. He had not spoken since they entered the mine, but his lips moved constantly in silent conversation with forces that dwelt in the spaces between light and shadow. The Celtic chamber should be just ahead, Father Mackenzie whispered, consulting a hand-drawn map that trembled in his weathered fingers. According to the mining company's original surveys, they stopped excavation when they encountered worked stone that their equipment couldn't break through. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern that took their breath away. Ancient standing stones formed concentric circles around a raised dais, their surfaces covered with spiral carvings that seemed to move in the lantern light. Between the stones, newer mining equipment lay abandoned, drills and sledgehammers scattered about like toys discarded by frightened children. At the center of the chamber, a rectangular opening had been blasted through the stone floor, revealing stairs that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rose from that opening carried the smell of earth and time and something else, something that made their primitive minds scream warnings about predators too large and too hungry for the human world to contain. Marcus stopped at the edge of the opening and finally spoke, his voice cycling through a dozen different speakers in rapid succession. "Here lies the prison," he said in Professor Blackwood's scholarly tone. "Here sleeps the hunger," he continued in Bridget O'Malley's Irish accent. "Here waits the ending of all things," he finished in Patrick Murphy's rough baritone. Dr. Cross approached the edge and peered into the Stygian depths, his lantern revealing only the first few stone steps before the darkness swallowed the light entirely. "How deep does it go?" "Deep enough to hold something that the ancient Druids feared to name," Father Mackenzie replied, opening his leather satchel and withdrawing objects that gleamed with their own inner light, silver daggers inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly, vials of oil that had been blessed in rites older than Christianity, and a chalice carved from a single piece of black stone. From the depths below came a sound that vibrated through the bedrock itself, a rhythmic pulsing like the heartbeat of something enormous stirring to wakefulness. With each pulse, the temperature in the chamber dropped another degree until their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. Marcus turned to face his family, and for a moment, his eyes were his own again, 7 years old, terrified, and heartbreakingly brave. "I understand now," he whispered in his own voice. "The voices, they've been trying to protect me, trying to prepare me for what I have to do. The guardian who came before me, he's down there in the dark, holding the prison closed with the last of his strength. But he's been alone for so long, and he's getting tired." Sarah Henley fell to her knees beside her son, gathering him into her arms as if she could shield him from destiny itself. "There has to be another way," she sobbed. "You're just a little boy. This isn't your responsibility." Marcus reached up with one small, cold hand and touched his mother's cheek with infinite gentleness. "The voices told me something, Mama. They said that some people are born to be bridges between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the light and the dark. They said I was born at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, to be the guardian this prison needs." The pulsing from below grew stronger, and hairline cracks began appearing in the ancient stones around them. Whatever was imprisoned beneath their feet was testing its bonds, preparing for one final push toward freedom. Father Mackenzie began arranging his ritual implements in a careful pattern around the opening, his hand steady despite the supernatural cold that was turning their breath to frost. "The binding ritual must be performed by the guardian himself," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was asking. "The words of power must be spoken with full understanding of their cost, and the sacrifice must be willing and pure. How do we know it will work? Thomas asked, his arm around his wife's shaking shoulders. We don't, Father Mackenzie admitted. But the alternative is letting that thing break free. And if it does? As if summoned by the priest's words, Marcus's face contorted into an expression of absolute malevolence, and the ancient entity's voice poured from his mouth like poison. If I break free, priest, I will turn this world into a charnel house. Every living thing will serve my appetite, every soul will be fuel for my resurrection. The boy has shown me what this reality offers, and I find myself ravenous. The entity's laughter echoed through the chamber, causing several of the standing stones to crack under the sonic assault. Through those cracks, a sickly phosphorescent light began to seep, and with it came the sound of something massive stirring in the depths. But perhaps we can reach an accommodation, the entity continued through Marcus's mouth. Give me the boy willingly, and I will make his transformation quick. Resist, and I will consume him slowly while you watch, savoring every moment of his terror as I hollow out his soul. Dr. Cross stepped forward, his medical bag in one hand and a silver dagger from Father Mackenzie's collection in the other. What if we offered ourselves instead? 3 adult lives for 1 child's freedom? The entity studied him through Marcus's pale eyes, and its smile was terrible to behold. Generous, doctor, but ultimately pointless. The boy is already mine, has been mine since the moment he first channeled the dead. His soul bears my mark now, shaped by months of serving as my voice in your world. Even if I released him, he would never be entirely human again. Sarah Henley's sobs echoed off the ancient stones, but Marcus gently pulled away from her embrace and walked toward the ritual circle Father Mackenzie had prepared. It's okay, Mama, he said in his own voice, though something in his tone suggested an acceptance beyond his years. I've been talking to the old guardian, the one who's been holding the prison closed all this time. His name was Finn, and he was about my age when he took on the duty. He says it's not as scary as it looks from the outside. The boy knelt within the circle of silver and blessed oil, his small hands folding in his lap with the same peaceful stillness he had maintained throughout his supernatural ordeal. Will it hurt? He asked Father Mackenzie. The priest's voice broke as he answered. I don't know, child. I pray not. Marcus nodded solemnly, then looked at each of his family members in turn. I love you, Papa. I love you, Mama. And Dr. Cross, thank you for trying to help me. Maybe someday, when you're very old and it's your time to join the voices, we can talk again. The pulsing from below reached a crescendo, and the ancient stones began to glow with eldritch fire. Whatever was imprisoned in the deepest chamber was making its final push for freedom, and the old guardian's strength was failing fast. Father Mackenzie began to chant in Gaelic, his voice growing stronger with each ancient word. The ritual implements blazed with their own light, and the very air seemed to thicken with power that predated written history. Marcus closed his eyes, the first time he had done so in over a month, and when he spoke, it was in a language none of them recognized, words that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The entity inhabiting Marcus let out a shriek of rage and terror that shattered every piece of glass in the chamber, and the boy's small body convulsed as 2 opposing forces waged war for control of his spirit. I will not be denied, the entity screamed through Marcus's mouth. I have waited 1,000 years for freedom, and I will not return to that cage. But Marcus's own voice cut through the supernatural chaos, calm and steady and filled with a strength that belonged to someone much older. You don't get to choose, he said simply. This is my purpose. This is what I was born to do. The boy rose to his feet and walked toward the opening in the floor, each step causing the ritual symbols to flare brighter. As he reached the edge, he turned back to his family one last time. Don't be sad, he said, and his smile was purely his own, 7 years old and heartbreakingly innocent. The old guardian says there are others like us down there, children who chose to stand watch over the dark places. We keep each other company, and we tell stories about the world above. With those words, Marcus stepped into the opening and began descending the ancient stairs. His lantern light grew fainter with each step until only his voice remained, chanting words of binding and protection in languages that had been old when the pyramids were young. The entity's screams followed him down, growing more distant and muffled with each passing moment until they faded to silence. The pulsing heartbeat from the depths slowed, steadied, and finally stopped entirely. In the sudden quiet, Father Mackenzie completed the binding ritual, speaking the final words that would seal the prison for another 1,000 years. The standing stones flared with brilliant light one last time, then settled into a gentle phosphorescent glow that would burn for centuries to come. Dr. Cross was the first to reach the opening and peer into the depths, but the stairs had vanished as if they had never existed. In their place lay only solid stone, unmarked by tool or time. "Is he?" Sarah whispered, unable to finish the question. "He's where he needs to be," Father Mackenzie said gently. "Standing guard, keeping the darkness at bay, protecting the world from horrors it will never know existed." As they made their way back through the tunnels toward the surface, none of them spoke of the small figure they thought they glimpsed in the shadows, a boy with pale blue eyes who watched over their retreat with infinite patience and love. The mine closed permanently the following week, officially due to safety concerns but really because the surviving miners refused to descend into tunnels that now echoed with whispered conversations and voices too young for the darkness they inhabited. Dr. Cross never practiced medicine again. He spent his remaining years documenting Marcus's story, though he was careful to present it as fiction, a ghost tale to entertain rather than a warning to heed. His journals, discovered after his death, spoke of dreams in which a 7-year-old boy visited him to share stories of the other guardians, children who had chosen duty over life and found purpose in eternal vigilance. The Henley farmhouse stood empty until it finally collapsed under the weight of Pennsylvania winters and the passage of time. But locals claim that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind carried whispers from the abandoned mine, you could still hear a mother's lullaby drifting from the ruins, Sarah Henley singing her son to sleep, wherever he might be standing watch in the spaces between worlds. Some children are born to build. Some are born to learn. And some, the rarest and bravest of all, are born to stand guard in the dark places where ancient hungers wait for their moment to feed. Marcus Henley had found his purpose in the depths beneath Centralia, and though he would never again see sunlight or feel his mother's embrace, he was no longer alone. In the darkness between worlds, the guardians kept their eternal vigil, protecting the living from truths too terrible to comprehend. The boy who didn't blink for 12 years had finally closed his eyes, but his watch would never end. If this story stayed with you, comment, "Some children are born to stand guard."